Miss Jody here with another video for biology. So we're continuing on, and like I said in the last video, I want to at least get through the categories of the first level biology to finish up our unit, or our year. The book still does have a few chapters after we finish that. That's going to be focusing on the side of the human anatomy and physiology, and so you can continue that at home. That way you have your own particular time studying that if you're interested in continuing on with that. But I definitely, to finish out our year, want to finish the main categories of biology. So we're finally moving into the new group. The last lesson was on the arthropoda, and now we're moving into the chordata. So with the book, what they do is they break chordata up into the study of chordata up into two main topics: the endothermic creatures of this main group, and then ectothermic creatures, and then the endothermic creatures of the phylum chordata. So as an introduction, now we're moving in, because we just finished studying not all of them, but the main categories of the invertebrates. So we had the sponges with porophora, the cnidarians with the jellies and all those guys. What else we do? The kind of dermata, the sea stars, sea cucumbers, all those creatures. And then we had the arthropod. We had the worms before that. Then we went into arthropoda with all the jointed leg creatures. And so now we're moving past the invertebrates into the vertebrate world. So the vertebrate world, like I said, the main phylum is going to be chordata, or some say chordata, but chordata, however you want to say it. And with this particular group, this is where humans will be a part of this main phylum. It will be broken down into 5 main categories. Well, most of the time, again, classification is crazy, and so people keep changing that, but as of now these 5 categories still remain. Of these 5 types of creatures from the chordates, we have some characteristics that all of them at some point, or most of them, we should always say most of them with biology, they share these common characteristics at some point in their stages of life, or their life cycle. Okay, so dorsal tubular nerve cord. And if you look in the book at the beginning of this chapter, it'll link these out, showing you these specific ones inside the center of a broken egg, a little chicken egg, so that you could see what they look like in their embryonic stage. But this dorsal tubular nerve cord is a developmental cord that eventually will be what we think of as the spinal cord. So all the chordates will have this dorsal tubular nerve cord that will eventually be like the form of some type of spinal cord. Also, the dorsal meaning back. Okay, so it runs along the back. Tubular meaning a tube where the nerve, a tubular nerve cord. Dorsal notochord. And you've heard this before. I think we studied this before. I don't know where, but maybe in genetics or something. We were trying to link everything together. But the notochord, it's kind of like this flexible cord, I guess, that provides protection and support. And eventually, with most of the vertebrates, the backbone will grow to replace the notochord. So in the beginning, we have this particular cord, but eventually it will become, for most of them, replaced. Now I'm just going to give you that little picture in your book here. So this is what I'm talking about. It will show you where the nerve cord is, and that's right here. This one right here, this little tubular guy here. I'm trying to not make this too blurry. And then the notochord there, right, this bottom part here. And then, so that's the first 2. And then there are the last 2 pharyngeal pouches. I think I said that right. Pharyngeal pouches. So those are like these little skin folds, and they're up towards the top where the face, where if you looked at an embryo, you would think that was sort of the face. So you see them like right up here, these little guys. And so they're like these little skin folds that can become different things on different animals, because again, these are characteristics that all of the creatures that will be in the phylum Chordata will have at some point in some stage of their life. And so these little folds with like aquatic creatures, they will end up being like the gill slits. And then like with ones that are more land-based, they'll eventually become part of the face or the neck, or the lower face and neck, or like the chest. And so in developmental stages, they're little pouches to start, but then they become other things. And then the last one, post-anal tail. Of course, I love to say exit hatch there. That's my favorite. So post-exit hatch tail, and that is what you would see on this egg. Again, I'm sorry I keep getting blurry, but just so you have this on your picture here, that little area there. Now, even the humans, this is weird because we're saying all of these four at some point in their life are exhibited for the most part in all the chordats. Well, and that's true, but the idea is that, I think my thing's getting blurry there, is that eventually this little post-anal tail or post-exit hatch tail, for humans, it's formed by the developing embryo, the spinal cord early, or the developing spinal cord early, but disappears by 8 weeks. Okay, so we do kind of start out with a tail, but then it disappears in a sense. Okay, and it's formed by that developing spinal cord. All right, so the 5 main groups that go underneath this phylum Chordata will be fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So when you first divide it up among those 5 categories, you get the basics to then add all the rest of the organisms underneath those categories. And so with a book, what it does is it separates those 5 down the line right here. It says, basically, let's study these first 3, because these are what we call the ectothermic of the group of the chordats. And that term is basically that they generally regulate their body temperature by the behavior rather than by internal metabolism. So we always talk about ectothermic creatures, and you have to watch me sometimes because with teaching biology and chemistry, I always go back and forth. So every now and then you'll hear me be like, oh, that's an exothermic creature and that's an endothermic creature. I mix those up instead of ectothermic, but it's the same kind of concept. This is what I think of in the sense of ectothermic creatures. They can't maintain the internal heat like endothermic creatures can, and so they have to have outside sources. So by their behavior, like laying in the sun or whatever, to maintain more of their heat and to have that maintain that body temperature. So you'll notice like a lot of the ectothermic creatures, like at the Science Center, they all have heating pads and light sources and such because of that. They're not able to maintain that. And so with the, now that doesn't mean the endothermic creatures, doesn't mean they don't like warm. The birds love it. Mammals, we love to lay out in the sun and get all warm. But we can maintain our body temperature by the process of internal metabolism. So the next chapter will go on to the endothermic creatures of the chordats. So right now, the ectothermic will be fish, amphibians, and reptiles, and then the next chapter will be birds and mammals. And then we'll define the endothermic, which obviously is just like I just said there. All right, so ectothermic creatures, we need an outside heat source and cannot maintain on their own. Now, of those 3, we start with fish. And with fish, they are strictly aquatic, which I'm sure is not a surprise to you. And so we have these aquatic little creatures. And a lot of times when you're doing lower level biology and you're trying to say, okay, what's some characteristics that all fish will have that we can say, okay, because you have this, you're put in the category of fish. And so sometimes these 2 main ones kind of help us sum it up. The fact that fish normally will have fins and gills. So fins and gills. So we look at we look at something like a jelly. which somebody would say a jellyfish, right? The jellies, they don't have the fins and the gills like we would say in the fish category. So we shouldn't be calling them jellyfish. We would say sea jellies or whatever they want to call them now. So with this general way of thinking, it at least gives us something to start with, okay? But you start with that, but that doesn't mean that it's a very simple category, because what happens is, first of all, the fish category is what's called a negative group, and what that means is that if you are in the vertebrates and phylum Chordata and you don't fit in any of these other guys, if you don't fit in any of the other 4 categories, you get thrown in the fish category. And it's weird because that's sometimes how it is with biology, and that's what a negative group means, that you are, if you don't fit anywhere else, you go in that group. And fish is that group. But the majority of the fish we can put into 3 main categories. Now, some scientists will say 6 categories or whatever. Again, it gets so complicated with biology. As long as you get the general term or the general feel for how we're putting them in categories, I think that's good enough, especially here at the end. All right, so the 3 main categories of the fish, what we could make it simple, is we have the category of the bony fish, cartilaginous fish, and the jawless fish. Okay, the bony fish, that's going to be about 95% of all fish species. And those are the common ones. You know, every fish that has, you know, the little fish look to it, goldfish, trout, catfish, grouper, anglerfish, bass, sturgeon, bluegill, all those. I just wrote a bunch of them out there. It doesn't matter because there's a trillion, right? They are what we would call the bony fish. And if you look at the skeleton, and of course you're supposed to do a fish dissection of a bony fish, and this gives you the internal side of the skeleton. You see the rib side of it and the bones. So you see bones that are why they're called bony. Now, cartilaginous ones, this is when the skeleton is entirely made of cartilage. And so these guys are still in the category of fish, fins and gills, but they have a cartilage life about them. That's the sharks, the skates, and the rays, and you've seen that before. And then there's the group called the jawless fish, and that's pretty characteristic to lacking a jaw. And they lack many characteristics of the vertebrates. There's even some that don't even have a vertebrate. Isn't that funny that you're put in this category of the vertebrates, you know, phylum Chordata, the vertebrates, and you don't have a vertebrate? Anyway, so that's the perfection of biology, right? Is we do the best we can, keeps changing, we learn more, we do our best, and it is what it is. All right, so some of these that are famous for the jawless category will be the hagfish and the lampreys. Now, what I'm going to do for the diversity of each one of these categories, fish, the amphibians, the reptiles, I'm going to send you some videos to watch. So you just get the book itself gives a lot of diversity, because each one of these categories, you could spend like doing like 7 pages. Like, let's do 3 pages on the bony fish and 3 pages on the cartilaginous and 3 on the jawless, but we're running out of time and of course running out of journal pages. And so we don't want to spend hours and hours, but there's so much to learn about the diversity. There's just so many amazing creatures, and they all have different little cool things about them. And so it would take a lot to really identify, understand, and put some effort into each one of these categories. But just as an overall, this is just showing us how to break it down. Now, in the book, because 95% of the fish are going to be in the bony category, what they do is they focus on the bony category, obviously. And so I gave you a little diagram, because this diagram needs to be, you need to be familiar with this in case we do get to dissect at some point. And you can just color these in, maybe color code them, and use your book for that. I think the book gives you the picture of the fish. Let me see, I know it does the external. Yes, it gives some of it in the book on page 355. So you can look at that for that diagram. And this is just some main things of bony fish, and then a couple of some of the other categories. But just to get a general overview. First of all, fins, what are they used for? For steering and maintaining stability. That makes sense, pretty easy. Scales. The scales are for protection. and they reduce the drag. And the scales are laid one right on top of each other, so it's a really tight fit. That's why it's reducing that drag. And then the fish also create a layer of mucus, and that waterproofs them and protects them from parasites, but then also helps them go faster through the water too. That's why they say if you do catch and release and you catch a fish and then you hold it in your hands and then you throw it back, you remove so much of that layer of mucus that you're actually causing the fish possible harm because of the parasite world that would love to attach to the fish and cause it extreme harm. So sometimes I think they have fake mucus that you can put back on your hands if you're fishing and doing catch and release. I'm not much of a fishing person, so I'm not sure, but I've heard that before. The lateral line, you've heard of the lateral line with fish. And so when you have the lateral line, what that basically is doing, it's this like sensory organ that detects the vibrations in the water. So you have it, they say it's electrically charged, and so there's the feeling of being able to sense like movements in the water so quickly, or even movements in the air that hit the water as the vibrations of sound and all that movement go through. All right, and then the counter shading. Counter shading, a lot of fish have this this area of what we call camouflage called counter shading, and that's when you have a lighter bottom, like at the bottom of your exterior is lighter and you're darker at the top. And that is good because let's say if you're a fish and you're swimming along and say there's a creature underneath you down here, he looks up and you have the light color towards you, which blends in more with the light coming from the surface of the water. But then if a fish wants to hide, let's say, and he's swimming down towards the bottom, then the top of him will be darker, maybe blending in with like the bottom of the seafloor or wherever, or wherever he's hiding in coral, whatever. So that counter shading, we see that a lot. We see that on snakes, we see it on fish. It is, thought to be a mechanism for protection in the category of camouflages. All right, the fish are going to have closed circulatory system, because at this point, once we get to the chordots, they're all like the most of the kingdom Animalia. They're the most of highly organized system type creatures. So closed circulatory system, a two-chambered heart. When you have a two-chambered heart, you mainly have one atrium and you have one ventricle. And so you have a situation of using those two to get your blood oxygenated, and then the deoxygenated blood to be able to be brought back and able to pick up more oxygen. So the two-chambered heart. They do have swim bladder, and the swim bladder, it'll fill with gases from the bloodstream or digestive tract to allow like that buoyancy side of the fish. And so with some of them have swim bladders. There are ones who don't, and then we have what we call bottom dwelling fish that don't have the swim bladders, because the swim bladder is almost like a flotation device, and it can blow up a little bit and make them rise up, or the gases can come out and they can sink down. The cartilaginous ones, many of the cartilaginous fish don't have the swim bladder either. So some of the bottom dwellers don't, and some of the cartilaginous ones don't. They have an oily liver, and that oily liver can create buoyancy also. And so they can use that to kind of sustain themselves in the water and going up and down and being light in a sense. Jaws, so some fish have jaws, obviously not the jawless, because that's the whole point for the most part, but bony in the cartilaginous ones. And the bony ones, they have like a second jaw kind of, it's like a second jaw, but it continues that process of breaking down the food. The cartilaginous ones, I don't think they have the second jaw, but of course we know with the sharks and stuff, they got a whole bunch of good teeth going on there to do the job. With the reproduction, now on the rest of these categories, because I'm trying to skim it down a little bit, I'm doing this generic many reproductive strategies. Okay, that's just funny in itself, okay? I never thought of it that way. Like, I don't talk to someone like, what are your reproduction strategies? No, you just don't talk like that. But here's the thing. Strategies mean like different ones are going to, like some fish do the spawning, and some have internal fertilization, with that mermaid's purse it talks about in the book. That's kind of cool. Maybe I'll try to find a video on that. But it all comes down to this, and this is just to make it simplified because we don't have enough time for the rest of the year to go into so much in depth about, you know, reproductive strategies. But the book does go into a lot of it, so you can use that when you're doing your homework, your study guides at the end of the chapters, okay? But it comes down to these three main things: oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. We talked about this already before when we started studying organisms. You've got and remember how I try to remember that? The O is like the egg layers, and then the viviparous will be the live birth, L-I-V-E, so I think of that V, and then ovoviviparous are the ones that have the, like they lay the eggs in the pouches or whatever, and then they have, and it seems like they're giving live birth, but they were once still egg layers. You remember that? So you got egg layers, you got the live birth, and then you got the middle guys. So it still comes down to a lot of different variety types with fish on how this all works out so that the fish species continues on. All right, so with the many reproductive strategies, we also have that fish are very important. They fill many different niches. So that means many different categories of, or like group areas of life, like groupings of living organisms that kind of fit together in their own little niche that we talked about when we studied ecology. All right, and then after the fish, because that's the first, remember when we're doing the 5 main chordate categories, fish, now we're on to amphibians, and then reptiles. And then we stop, and the next chapter will be birds and mammals. All right, so with the next 2, what I've done is, because we are supposed to do dissection of at least the frog, I'm sending you this diagram. This is the dissection to get ready for the frog and labeling the different parts. And I'm pretty sure it doesn't show every, well, it might show every part in our book, but you might have to have another diagram to fill in a couple of these. I'll have to check how many are there, but you can use your book and other resources. This is the diagram of the snake, and thankfully the internal anatomy of the snake. Thankfully, we don't have to dissect a snake because that's just terribly sad. And we love our snakes here at the Science Center and our lizards and all that, so we don't want to get into that world, right? It's not terrible when it's a worm, but a snake is just really sad. But with this, our book does not give all of these particular ones. So I'm going to send you a picture with the diagram labeled so that you can fill that in. And again, color code these so that they're matching to the actual anatomy of the snake too. All right, so get that one ready for dissection and get this one ready just to understand the anatomy of the snake. These 2 are our next 2 categories, the amphibian world and the reptile world. Now, of course, frogs and snakes are not all there is to it, but that's just for that diagram to go with these 2. So as you can see, I've done the amphibians here and just some basic stuff about the amphibians, the reptiles here and basic stuff about the reptiles. So like I said, getting towards the end here, I don't want to go on forever, and I don't want everyone to have to keep taking these half-sheet notes when we thought we'd already be back together. So I'm making it pretty simple, but you can do more in-depth in your book. Okay, so as an easy way to look at the amphibians. First of all, the amphibians are said to be those with a double life. That's what the word amphibious means. If someone says, oh, Miss Jody, she's very amphibious, it's true because I do teach science during the day, but at night I am a spy. And I know you guys don't know that, but it's true. And so I live this double life. And the amphibians also live a double life, most of them. And again, just like all biology, you can't, there's always that exception category. But most of them will have a life between, at some point in their life cycle, water and land. So that might mean that they might start out in water as their babies and then eventually move to land, or it might be that they go back and forth between water and land. Now, there are some that are strictly water. Of course, because there's always the exception. There's some that are strictly land, and they still fit in this category because some of these other characteristics. But as a general way of remembering, amphibians are the double life water-land creatures. 3 main categories: the frogs and the toads, the salamanders and the newts, and the caecilians, or caecilians, however you say it. Caecilians, I can never say it right. So these are frogs and toads. That's pretty simple. They underneath the same category, and there's a lot to understand about frogs and toads, like how to tell the difference, and you can look at like the way they lay their eggs and all that stuff. The toads lay their eggs in long chains, and I always say they're totally organized, and frogs lay them in clusters, and you know the difference between the salamanders and the newts. And then these guys, the caecilians or whatever, they almost look like they're like a worm snake. They're like a worm snake guy, but they're not. They're not worms and they're not snakes. They're amphibians, but they just look like that. They're just so weird looking, and they have characteristics like the amphibian, so therefore they get in the amphibian category. And like I said, I'm going to give you a video for all of these main groups so you can look at some of the variety and some of the diversity in all these creatures. So what are some main characteristics of amphibians? First of all, thin, moist, highly permeable skin. What that means is the skin is thin and moist so that therefore it can function in respiration. So they can actually breathe through their skin. But here's the thing, most still possess lungs too. So that many times they have a dual breathing situation. But this is why they always say don't pick up amphibians and touch them a lot, because of that skin situation, and especially if you have Purell on your hands, they'll bring it right into their skin. They'll breathe it right in. And so these guys are very sensitive in that sense. And this is why they also call them a biological indicator, meaning if the amphibians start dying off in an area, an ecosystem, you know something's wrong, because they're so sensitive to things like toxins in the water or toxins in the air, fungi, different things. If it gets out of balance, they will start having trouble. And that's a great indicator that something might not be right, biologically sustainable in that area. So the other thing is they secrete mucus when they're on land, and that keeps that moisture, and that keeps well for respiration, to help with the respiration. They lack a diaphragm, and so they have to have other creative ways of getting those, you know how the diaphragm will expand the lungs, and so they have to have another way of doing that. And so they do what's called buccal pumping. You've ever seen like the bottom of the throat of like the frog doing that weird thing? That's a sound effect for you, because I know as a lot of you students talked about how much you miss of my really good sound effects and my drawings, how like you miss that. And it's just, I understand, you know, it's pretty classic, and I do have skills in those areas. Definitely drawing on the board is one of my best skills, and my sound effects. And singing, I'm gonna spare you on that one, but singing good songs about things like biology. Okay, but anyway, so they will do those weird buccal pumping things that create the movement because of the lack of diaphragm. They do have a closed circulatory system, so we're very advanced creatures at this point, with a 3-chambered heart. So they have like 2 of the aortas, and then they have the 1 ventricle. And one of the aorta is linked to blood that has oxygen, and the other one's linked to the one that doesn't, that's deoxygenated, that needs to get back. And then they both pour into the ventricle, but they pump at different times. So one will pour in that has the oxygenated blood, and then the other one will pour in after. So there's not a lot of that mixing of the bloods, of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So that's kind of a cool how that works. The larvae, which will be the smaller version, generally are herbivores. And so if you've seen little tadpoles or any of those little guys, the babies of these 3. But the adults a lot of times are carnivorous, the carnivores, and they love they're vicious, these vicious frogs and toads. No, seriously, they are. Oh no, that's the turtles. Never mind, that's a lie. But we remember when we used to have the frogs and toads that lived inside the thing at the Science Center with the turtles? And those turtles, they lived with them in harmony for so long, like it was like a year. And then all of a sudden they just went crazy and started ripping the frogs and the toads apart. And we had that big planetarium, which was a mixture between, it had the like a terrarium with plant life and water and all that, but it had plants and all these different different living organisms, and we were trying to make them all live in happy harmony. And wow, that was, yeah, anyway. But yeah, that was actually the reptiles that were violent. I was about to say, yeah, the frogs and toads, they're just vicious, but I forgot they were the ones that were getting eaten. Oops. All right, but anyway, so the adult carnivores. Then we have a nervous system that's pretty developed, and that's one reason too why we dissect the frog. Is a lot of similar parts that we have, so we can see, other than differences, you know, in the chambered heart and all that, but you can find the little lungs, you can find the stomach, you can find the intestines. It's a smaller version, but it's really good for us to see it laid out like that. So the nervous system, they have a central and a peripheral, like we do, obviously a little less exciting and complex as ours. And they can adjust to many different temperatures. And so what happens is, because they are in the ectotherm category, that means they need an outside source to maintain their body heat. So if it gets bad, like either too hot or too cold, they can go into these different processes. The torpor state is when they kind of lower their metabolism down to like barely alive, but they're still alive. And then that way they don't have to waste any energy if they can't keep up with, like if they don't have a heat source or whatnot. Estivation, that's when when it's actually too hot and they want to go bury themselves like in mud and stuff to stay cool. Hibernation, you've heard of that before, in that sleeping state. And there's that antifreeze, that one frog. I don't know if it's just that one or if many do, but remember that one frog you probably have heard of before who his antifreeze that goes along with his hibernation. How does it work? I forget. I'll have to look that up and see but he pretty much pumps it through his body. And no, actually there might be many of them that do that. That might be part of many of those creatures. I'd have to look up about the salamanders and newts and the caecilians, who are involved in that. I think in our book it might, let's see, in our book it says the wood frogs of Alaska produce a substance in their blood that acts as antifreeze, preventing ice crystals from forming in their tissues while they sleep through the winter. So that would be that antifreeze side of things. And basically, if we could imagine figuring out that in our human body, we could just freeze ourselves and, you know, if we needed to. I don't know why, but it sounds like a great idea. And so then there's also creative reproduction strategies. Woo! Okay, and there's a lot in our book about, you know, the weird frogs who have like the eggs on their back and they carry them around until the eggs hatch, and all kinds of weird, crazy things that these frogs and toads and newts and salamanders do. It's really creepy. Then we have the reptiles. The reptiles, they are normally thought of as dry, scaly skin and scutes. And so you're used to the scales that you hear about with reptiles. The scutes are kind of larger like scales. They're made of the same thing, the keratin. So all of these things, the scales and the scutes on reptiles are made of keratin. And that's just kind of a general thing. Just like we did with fish. We said fish, fins and gills, general. Amphibians, double life, that's general. Reptiles, scales and scutes, a general way of thinking about this category. So the reptiles with their scales and scutes, they're going to be made into 4 main categories. Turtles and the tortoises, lizards and the snakes, crocodiles and the alligators, and then the tuturas. And I put in here the 3-eye guy, because that's what he's famous for. He's that kind of weird, seems like he should go over here with lizards, but he has some unique characteristics that he got his own category. And one of them is that specific, like that 3rd eye on the top of his head. And it's not really like a full eye, but it's a light. It can detect light and light can come in, and it kind of it's like senses the light from the top and is able to, in a sense, sort of see from that 3rd eye. So I just call him the 3rd eye guy. And these guys are neat. They actually are studying them pretty intensely now, trying to figure them out, because some of them can live for long time. And they're just trying to study them in more detail. But with these 4 main categories, we have some general characteristics for the most part. Closed circulatory system, again, nice, and we're getting up into these more complex creatures with a 3-chambered heart. So we had the original with the fish was the 2-chambered heart, and then we had moving up to the amphibian, we had the 3-chambered heart, and then we have the reptiles, a 3-chambered heart. But some of them, I think it's the crocodiles, it's one group, that actually has 4-chambered hearts, and they're the only ectothermic creature that has 4-chambered heart. And then after that, like when you get up to birds and mammals, that's when it changes there, because there will be endothermic creatures. Okay, and so we see some of the differences among how the heart and all that among different creatures, depending on the characteristics, like ectothermic or endothermic too. So that's kind of cool. They lack a diaphragm, just like we saw with the amphibians, so they have to have creative ways to allow this expansion with the lungs. And they have more complex brains than the amphibians, it looks as to be in the fish. They have good eyesight but poor hearing. So they don't have the hearing like they normally would. You'd normally think that they hear really well, but they don't normally have the best hearing. They can hear in some frequencies, but they don't have the best hearing. They do sample the air. They taste the air. So they taste you. That's part of their smelling sense. They have that the molecules fall on their tongue, and then they bring it up to the Jacobson's organ in the roof of their mouth and pretty much taste, what you are. Are you human? Are you, a rodent that I can eat or whatever? With reproduction, I didn't rewrite that again, but again, it's creative reproduction strategies. Oviparous, ovoviviparous, and viviparous. So when it comes down to the reproduction, we have the whole range in these guys too. When it comes to the one defining characteristic that starts to set out here in this new category is amniotes. If you ever heard of someone being an amniote, that is when the unborn baby or the unborn creature is surrounded by amnion. So if you ever heard somebody say, oh yeah, amniotic fluid, if you ever heard that, what they're talking about is specifically this amnion, which protects the baby or the unborn in the egg in this kind of protective, it's like watery kind of situation. Not watery, I guess that wouldn't be a great, but you understand what I'm saying. It's a fluid, that's what I'm looking for. And so these guys are amniotes, which are then the next category. We move on to the birds are amniotes, and the mammals are amniotes. So we have some in common with our reptile friends. Okay, so that's some generals with the amphibians and the reptiles and the fish. Okay, so of the groups of the chordates that we have to study, the 5 main chordates, we studied the fish, we studied the amphibians, we studied the reptiles. And then the next chapter will be birds and the mammals. And then guess what will be done? And we can check off the Biology 101 course. And I will still be gluing. I've already went through and glued in all the tests up into, I don't know when I did this, like a week or 2 ago, I forget. But this last chapter, the arthropods, I have to put the test in, and then I have to put the test in, or the quiz in for the ectotherms, and then I'll put it in for the endotherms and then we'll be done. And we'll still have those blank tests that you can work on at home whenever I have the journal pickup. Even if we don't get back together, you can come pick up your journal, and then I'll finish them up and then tell you when, and you can use that to study, and then I'll send out the final exam. Okay, and then that way you can do that after studying and using your journal and everything. And then you can send that back to me as a PDF or whatever in the Google Classroom once you're finished with that. But again, we'll have one more video next week, and maybe because some of my other classes are finished, I might be able to get to making that last video even this week sometime. And then you'll be done with everything, and then I can get all the journals ready and have you pick them up. So, but again, I still want to do dissections. But if we can't get together, at least you could get your journal to study, finish your exam, and then if we do get back together, you could always bring me your journal back. We could do the dissections. I could take the pictures and put them in. So anyway, we'll make it work. Okay, miss you guys.